Hey there. Welcome back for another deep dive.
Uh,
Today we're tackling a topic that's been making headlines for decades. And honestly, it can feel pretty overwhelming to keep up with.
yeah.
We're talking about the situation in the Middle East, specifically the ongoing conflicts involving Israel.
Right.
We've got a stack of insightful sources to help us unpack this, expert analysis from foreign policy, some on-the-ground reporting from the BBC's Jeremy Bowen, and then we'll be digging into some thought-provoking pieces from Foreign Affairs and The Guardian. You might be asking yourself, can lasting peace in this region ever be a reality? Or are we just witnessing the beginning of an even bigger conflict? Well, those are the questions we're going to try to answer today.
What I find particularly interesting is that we're not just looking at a snapshot of the present, we're going to try to project forward, considering the potential trajectory of the entire region. To do that, we need to look at the ripple effects of past conflicts and understand what's motivating all the key players involved.
Right, because this isn't just history. It's a living, breathing situation. And it's been a year now since Hamas launched that attack on Israel. I'm sure you remember seeing the news.
Oh, yeah.
It's a tense situation, to say the least. Gaza is devastated. And despite all the talk about ceasefires, peace seems like a distant hope.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me from foreign policy is that they're calling this a Pyrrhic victory for Israel. That sounds almost contradictory. Can you break down what that means?
A Pyrrhic victory is basically a win that comes at such a high cost that it almost feels like a defeat. And when we apply that to the situation in Israel, we can see how the cost of this conflict in terms of lives lost, resources depleted, and the potential for future instability is incredibly high. It makes you question whether the gains made are actually worth the price paid.
And that makes me think about something else I read. The Atlantic Council suggests we could be seeing the beginning of a long-term, low-intensity war. Now, what would that look like for people actually living in the region?
Imagine living under a constant shadow of tension, with sporadic bursts of violence, strikes, incursions, attacks, assassinations. It's a grim picture, but unfortunately a plausible one given the current dynamics. It's almost like a whack-a-mole situation. Every time one threat seems to be contained, another one pops up somewhere else. And in that environment, it's incredibly difficult to build trust and work towards a meaningful peace agreement.
That sounds incredibly difficult to live with. And it seems like Israel's strategy is changing. With Hamas weakened, they're shifting their focus towards Hezbollah and Lebanon, and of course Iran. This seems like a big deal. So help me understand why this shift is so significant and what it could mean for the region as a whole.
Well, Hezbollah is a much more formidable force than Hamas. They're better equipped, organized, and have a stronger track record of challenging Israel. Then you add Iran into the mix, and things get even more complicated. Iran has its own agenda in the region, and their involvement could significantly escalate the situation. We're talking about a potential regional war with global implications.
So the stakes are incredibly high. And when we look at expert opinions in foreign policy, it seems like some people believe this shift in focus makes sense for Israel in the short term. But other experts warn that this approach could actually fuel more instability and potentially create new extremist groups. It feels like a dangerous gamble.
Absolutely. Every action has a reaction. And in a region as volatile as the Middle East, those unintended consequences can be devastating. It's a real tightrope walk for Israel, trying to find a way to maintain their security without inadvertently creating more enemies in the process.
Speaking of potentially creating enemies, there's a quote from Dalia Dasake in Foreign Affairs that really stood out to me. She says that Israel seems to be pursuing total victory instead of actively trying to find a diplomatic solution. That seems pretty extreme.
It certainly raises a lot of questions. What does total victory even mean in this context? Is it realistic? Can it even be achieved in a way that leads to lasting peace? Historically, we've seen that the pursuit of absolute victory often leads to prolonged conflicts and creates deep resentment, making future violence even more likely.
And how does that tie in with the conflict with Hamas?
Well, this idea of seeking total victory could really jeopardize the already slim chance of achieving peace with the Palestinians.
And that's a conflict many experts view as Israel's most significant challenge.
Yeah.
It feels like we might be seeing history repeat itself in a way.
It's true. There are definitely some historical parallels here. Some voices, particularly those who favor a more aggressive approach, are advocating for a forced reordering of the entire Middle East. It's an idea that draws comparisons to what happened after 9/11 with the intervention in Iraq.
So let's talk about Iraq for a minute. Did that intervention actually achieve its intended goals?
Well, that's a complex question. And the answer depends on who you ask. The official goal was to remove Saddam Hussein from power and stop him from using weapons of mass destruction, which we now know turned out to be based on faulty intelligence.
Right. And Jeremy Bowen from the BBC makes a really important point about this. He argues that forcing another major reordering of the Middle East could actually make the situation much worse, just like it did in Iraq. What are your thoughts on that?
There's definitely a risk involved in trying to impose a solution from the outside, especially without addressing the underlying issues and engaging with all the parties involved. The Iraq War is often cited as an example of how interventions can backfire, leading to more instability, power vacuums, and ultimately more violence and suffering.
So if forcing a reordering is off the table, what is the path forward?
Well, most experts seem to agree that the most urgent priority is achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. It's the only way to de-escalate the situation and create some breathing room for diplomacy to even begin.
But getting to a ceasefire isn't easy, is it? What are the main roadblocks standing in the way?
You have to consider the deep mistrust on both sides. This distrust has been fueled by decades of conflict and broken promises. Then you have the internal political pressures within both Israel and Palestine. Leaders often feel the need to appease their own bases, even if that means making concessions for peace becomes more difficult. And lastly, you can't forget about the external players who each have their own agendas and interests in the region.
And speaking of external actors, there's one big question hanging over all of this. Can the Biden administration, with its traditionally close ties to Israel, actually be an effective mediator in this situation?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The U.S. has a long history of involvement in the Middle East, and they hold significant diplomatic and economic leverage. But their close relationship with Israel could make it difficult for them to be seen as an impartial mediator by the Palestinians.
That's a tough spot to be in. And digging into all of this really emphasizes how complicated and intertwined the situation in the Middle East is.
It's true. There are so many layers of history, religion, politics, and geopolitics all woven together. There are no easy answers. And trying to oversimplify things can lead to missing some very important details.
So where does that leave us? What are the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the potential for further conflict in the Middle East is very real. This is a region on edge, and even a small spark could ignite a much larger fire. And as we've discussed, the pursuit of total victory rather than a negotiated solution might actually be counterproductive, leading to more instability and violence in the long run. It does paint a rather bleak picture. You have to wonder if lasting peace is even attainable in our lifetime.
It feels almost impossible after hearing all of this. But history has shown us that even the most deeply rooted conflicts can eventually be resolved, sometimes in ways that seemed completely unimaginable just a few years earlier.
That's an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the current situation and lose sight of the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's try to be optimistic for a minute. Given everything we've discussed, do you think this century-long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians can actually be resolved within our lifetime? And if so, what would it take to get there?
It's a tough question, but I do believe it's possible. However, it would require a monumental shift in thinking on both sides. You would need leaders who are courageous enough to make difficult compromises, even if it means facing backlash from their own people.
That's a tall order. It seems like politicians are always more worried about getting reelected than doing what's actually best for everyone in the long run.
You're right. There are always political considerations, but real change requires taking risks. It also means being willing to acknowledge the other side's legitimate grievances and truly listening to their narratives. You can't build peace if you don't understand where the other side is coming from.
And empathy seems to be in short supply these days.
It's true, but it's a crucial ingredient for peace building. And perhaps most importantly, it would require a commitment to building trust. That's something that's been eroded by decades of violence and broken promises.
So how do you rebuild trust when there's been so much pain and suffering on both sides?
It's a long and difficult process. It involves acknowledging past wrongs, taking concrete steps to address them, and demonstrating a genuine commitment to a different future. It also requires a willingness to take risks and believe that change is possible, even when it feels like hope is fading.
That kind of optimism is hard to come by in a situation like this, but it sounds like a ceasefire in Gaza is really the first step towards creating that space for trust and dialogue.
Absolutely. A ceasefire is essential for de-escalating the situation and creating the breathing room needed for diplomacy to even begin.
But how do you even get to a ceasefire? when both sides feel so deeply entrenched in their positions?
It requires finding common ground, however small it may seem. It could involve confidence-building measures like prisoner exchanges or humanitarian aid agreements. It also requires external pressure from the international community.
And that brings us back to the role of the U.S. and the Biden administration. We talked earlier about their close relationship with Israel. Do you think they have what it takes to be effective mediators in this situation?
Well, they certainly have the potential. The U.S. has historically played a significant role in Middle East peace negotiations, and they wield a lot of influence in the region.
But you also mentioned that their close ties with Israel could make it hard for them to be seen as impartial by the Palestinians?
That's right. To be successful mediators, they'll need to demonstrate a genuine commitment to understanding and addressing the concerns of both sides. They'll need to engage with Palestinian leadership in a meaningful way and avoid the perception that they're simply taking Israel's side.
So it sounds like it's a balancing act for the U.S. How do you think they can strike that balance effectively?
It requires a delicate approach that combines diplomacy, pressure, and incentives. They can use their diplomatic channels to encourage both sides to come to the negotiating table. They can also leverage their economic and military aid to encourage concessions and discourage actions that escalate the conflict.
It sounds like there's a lot at stake for the U.S. in this situation.
There is. The U.S. has a vested interest in stability in the Middle East, both for geopolitical reasons and for the sake of regional peace and security.
And we can't forget the human cost of this conflict. We've talked about the potential for a wider war. But even in a low-intensity conflict, people are still dying. Families are being torn apart, and lives are being disrupted.
That's right. The human toll of this conflict is immeasurable. It's easy to get caught up in the political and strategic considerations. But we must never forget that real people are bearing the brunt of this violence.
It's a sobering thought, and I think it highlights the urgency of finding a path towards peace.
It does. The longer this conflict continues, the more lives will be lost, the more damage will be done, and the harder it will be to break the cycle of violence.
You mentioned earlier that the pursuit of total victory might be counterproductive. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. The idea of total victory implies that one side completely defeats the other, achieving all of its objectives. But in a conflict as complex as this one, with such deep historical and emotional roots, that kind of outcome is unlikely and perhaps even undesirable.
Why undesirable? Wouldn't it be good to see one side finally triumph over the other and bring an end to the conflict?
It might seem that way on the surface, but in reality, imposing a solution through force rarely leads to lasting peace. It often creates resentment and a desire for revenge, sowing the seeds for future conflicts.
So what's the alternative?
The alternative is a negotiated settlement, a compromise where both sides make concessions to achieve a shared outcome. It's a process that requires both sides to recognize the other's legitimacy and to be willing to give up some of their demands.
That sounds incredibly challenging.
It is, but it's the only path that has a chance of leading to a sustainable peace.
So how can we move towards a negotiated solution?
It starts with dialogue. Both sides need to be willing to come to the table and engage in good faith negotiations. That means listening to each other's perspectives, understanding their concerns, and exploring areas of common ground.
But what about the deep mistrust we talked about earlier? How can you have meaningful dialogue when both sides are suspicious of each other's motives?
Building trust takes time and effort. It requires small steps, confidence-building measures, and a willingness to take risks. It also requires external actors like the U.S. to play a constructive role in facilitating dialogue and mediating disputes.
So it's a multifaceted process.
It is. There's no magic formula for resolving this conflict. It requires a combination of diplomacy, political will, and a shared commitment to peace.
We've talked a lot about the obstacles to peace, but are there any reasons for optimism? Are there any signs that a resolution might be possible?
Despite the grim realities we've discussed, there are always reasons for hope. Both Israelis and Palestinians have shown a desire for peace in the past. There have been periods of relative calm, and there have been individuals on both sides who have dedicated their lives to building bridges and promoting understanding.
So there's a flicker of hope, even in the darkest of times.
There is. Human beings have an incredible capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and reconciliation. It's what allows us to overcome even the most seemingly intractable conflicts.
That's an encouraging thought. But even if there is a will for peace, it seems like there's a lack of a clear path forward. What needs to happen to create a more concrete roadmap to peace?
That's a question that's been debated for decades. There are many different proposals and frameworks out there, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
So what are some of the key elements that a viable peace plan would need to include?
A viable peace plan would need to address the core issues that lie at the heart of the conflict. That includes the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, security arrangements, and the borders of a future Palestinian state.
Those are all incredibly complex issues.
They are, but they can't be ignored. Any lasting solution will require addressing these core issues in a way that's just and equitable for both sides.
So how do you even begin to tackle such complex issues?
It requires a willingness to compromise. Both sides will need to accept that they won't get everything they want. They'll need to be flexible and creative in finding solutions that meet the needs of both Israelis and Palestinians.
And that brings us back to the need for strong and visionary leadership.
Absolutely. Leaders who are willing to take risks, challenge the status quo, and make tough decisions. Leaders who are committed to peace and who have the courage to stand up to those who oppose it.
It sounds like finding such leaders is a challenge in itself.
It is. But history has shown us that such leaders can emerge, often in the most unexpected of circumstances. Sometimes it takes a crisis, a moment of profound change to shake things up and create the conditions for new leadership to arise.
So perhaps the current crisis, with all its challenges and complexities, could actually be an opportunity for change.
It's possible. Crises can be catalysts for transformation. They can force people to confront uncomfortable truths, to reassess their priorities, and to consider new possibilities.
So what are some of the potential opportunities for change that you see emerging from this current situation?
One opportunity is the growing recognition, both within Israel and internationally, that the status quo is unsustainable. The current cycle of violence and mistrust is benefiting no one.
So there's a growing sense that something needs to change.
There is. And that creates an opening for new ideas and approaches.
What about the role of the international community? How can they contribute to creating a more positive outcome?
The international community has a crucial role to play. They can provide diplomatic support, economic assistance, and security guarantees. They can also help to build trust and facilitate dialogue between the parties.
But we've seen in the past that international involvement can sometimes be counterproductive.
That's true. International actors need to be careful not to impose their own solutions or to take sides. Their role should be to support the peace process, not to dictate its terms.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is, but with the right approach, the international community can be a powerful force for peace.
We've talked a lot about the big picture, the geopolitical dynamics, and the role of leaders. But what about the people on the ground? What can ordinary individuals do to contribute to peace?
There's a lot that ordinary people can do. They can engage in dialogue with people from the other side, challenge stereotypes and prejudices, and support organizations that are working to build peace.
So even small actions can make a difference.
They can. Every act of kindness, every gesture of understanding, every voice raised for peace contributes to creating a more hopeful future.
It's inspiring to hear that even amidst such a complex and challenging conflict, there's still room for individual action and hope.
There is. Peace is not something that's imposed from above. It's something that's built from the ground up, through the efforts of countless individuals working together to create a better world.
That's a powerful message. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such a massive conflict. But you're reminding us that even individual actions can contribute to positive change.
Exactly. And remember, we're not just talking about Israelis and Palestinians here. People around the world can play a role in supporting peace efforts, whether it's through raising awareness, donating to organizations working in the region, or simply engaging in respectful dialogue about this complex issue.
So much of what we've discussed today has focused on the challenges, the deep-rooted conflicts, and the potential for even more violence. It's easy to walk away feeling pessimistic. But I want to circle back to something you said earlier about hope. You said there's always reason for hope, even in the darkest of times. What gives you hope when you look at this situation?
Well, despite all the setbacks and disappointments, there's a resilience in the human spirit that refuses to be extinguished. I see hope in the young people on both sides who are tired of the conflict and who are working to build bridges of understanding. I see hope in the civil society organizations that are tirelessly promoting dialogue and reconciliation. And I see hope in the international community's growing commitment to finding a peaceful resolution.
It sounds like you're saying that even though the headlines might focus on the negativity, There's a lot of positive work happening behind the scenes that we don't always hear about.
Absolutely. There's a whole network of people dedicated to peace building, and their work is often thankless and dangerous, but they persist because they believe in a better future.
It's inspiring to hear about their efforts. It gives you a sense that change is possible, even in the most challenging circumstances.
And remember, peace is not a destination, it's a journey. There will be setbacks along the way, there will be moments of despair, but the pursuit of peace is a worthy cause, and we should never give up hope.
I think that's a great place to leave things. This has been a really insightful deep dive into a very complex issue, and I hope our listeners feel better equipped to understand the nuances of the situation in the Middle East.
It's a constantly evolving situation, but staying informed and engaging in thoughtful discussions is crucial.
And for those of you who want to delve even deeper, we've compiled some additional resources for you. You'll find those linked in the show notes. So until next time, keep exploring, keep learning. And remember, there's always reason for hope.